And now we have what we have because the Russians don't bluff. That's lesson number one out of this whole thing is the Russians don't bluff. So as you evaluate what's going on, you hear a lot of spin out there about what's happening, the Russian this, Russian that. Take the Russians at face value. When they say they're going to do something, they're going to do something exactly the way they said they're going to do it. So that's where we are today. We have a major war ongoing in Ukraine, one that, by the way, Russia is winning decisively. I'm not here to promote war. You know, this is an anti-war group, but we're here to talk about the facts. And the fact is, Russia is winning this war decisively. We can go through the metrics all you want. You know, I have a huge amount of experience in this. I've been studying military math all my life. And I'm telling you right now, whatever metric you put up there, Russia has won this war hands down. And they're in the process of, I believe, wrapping up one of the most stunning military victories in modern history. But you won't hear about that because our media is spinning it the exact opposite. And maybe we can talk about why that is at a later date, but that's where we are today. I hope that wasn't too long of an answer. There's never been a democracy in Ukraine. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt nations on the planet. Everybody talks about Russian oligarchs. The Ukrainians have more oligarchs per capita than the Russians do, and their oligarchs actually control the politics. How did Zelensky become president? Zelensky was a comedian working for a channel owned by an oligarch who decided, I want to make you president. Zelensky didn't wake up one day and go, I want to be president. He played one on TV, a very popular comedy, I think called Servant of the People. I've watched it. Funny as heck. Really good show. You should watch it. But it's not reality. It's fiction. But it's like if Americans were watching West Wing and decided to elect Martin Sheen as president because he played one on TV. Martin Sheen has no qualification to be president of the United States. But he played one on TV, so we're gonna make him president. Well, that's what the Ukrainians did because the state of their politics is so horrible. But going back to 2014, there was a pro-Russian president named Viktor Yanukovych who was struggling with a major economic problem. The majority of Ukrainians wanted to be aligned with the European Union economically. I think they saw that their best economic future was through Europe, not through Moscow. The problem is the conditions that the European Union were seeking to impose were prohibitive. And it would have required actually Russia to pay for Ukraine to become an EU member. And Putin met with Yanukovych and said, look, I don't care if you join the EU. I'm just not going to pay for it. Russia's not paying for it. So if you want to join. But if you can't afford it, then you got to come in and work with me. And so Yanukovych thought about it and said, okay, we can't afford it. I'm going to Russia. Well, the people rose up. There was demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations, by the way, very peaceful demonstrations, the legitimate expression of democracy. I don't think anybody had a problem. Yanukovych didn't have a problem with these demonstrations. He understood where they were coming from. But then what happens is the United States and the European Union come in and say, there's a weakness here. We can solve this problem by orchestrating a coup d'etat that will eliminate Yanukovych, and we can bring in our own people. And these are people that the United States government had identified early on, and we had been training them actively. How do we know this? Because Victoria Nuland, who was the State Department official responsible for that part of the world, has been intercepted with a phone call, a famous phone call where she told the European Union something that we can't say on polite channels, but she also talked about our boy Yats. Yats, of course, is short for the name of a man who eventually became the prime minister of Ukraine. We handpicked this guy. We handpicked the government. We were talking about Yats competing with Klitschko and all this stuff, and who's going to be the best person. We're making the decisions. And this is a coup d'etat. Now, the peaceful demonstrators can't get rid of Yanukovych. So we brought in the people we know. We brought in the Bandera people. And they came in armed. They seized, they stormed police armories, took weapons, came down, and they overnight, they turned what was a peaceful demonstration in the Maidan Plaza into a violent revolution that killed scores of people. horrible acts of violence. I mean, again, I'm not, I don't want to get too political here. We call what happened in January 6th of last year an insurrection of 2021, I think, an insurrection. The horrific storming of the U.S. Capitol. I condemn it with all my heart. I view that as a gross acts of violence. That's a demonstration gone bad, but it wasn't an insurrection, ladies and gentlemen. An insurrection, they would not have voluntarily left the Capitol. An insurrection would have gone in with guns blazing, killing every member of Congress. That's what an insurrection does. How do we know? Because there was an insurrection in the Maidan in February 2014. That's what an insurrection looks like. It was a U.S. orchestrated insurrection to achieve one purpose, to get rid of Viktor Yanukovych. How do we know that? Because Joe Biden called Viktor Yanukovych in person and said, "You got to go." I don't mean to get angry, but come on, man. What is regime change policy? We've never had regime change policy. Why did Biden get on the phone and tell Yanukovych he has to go? That's regime change policy, literally, writ large, big letters. And he left. But now what happened? You created this mess. You've empowered these Nazis, and they're now in charge. Now, people say, again, but Scott, they're minorities, man. They're just, okay, yeah, they had the violence in the Maidan and all that. But at the end of the day, when they ran for parliament, they didn't get majorities in parliament. Well, you know what? Who else didn't have a majority? The Bolsheviks. You go back and study Russian history, you got these two major elements. You got the Mensheviks, which means small, and the Bolsheviks, which means big. But the Mensheviks are actually big, and the Bolsheviks are actually small. Why did the Bolsheviks win? Because they were violent. They were violent. And so now you've empowered these Bandera worshiping neo-Nazis to come in and seize power, and they're not going to let it go. They immediately intimidate the Ukrainian Rada to start passing laws that empower nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism, at the expense of Russian-speaking Ukrainians and ethnic Russians. They outlaw the language, they outlaw the culture, and then they violently seek to impose their will. They go down to Odessa, city on the coast. There's a riot there after a soccer game. They throw 150 pro-Russian demonstrators into the House of Culture, then set it on fire. Over 40 people die. The Russians are enraged. The Ukrainians start to make a move towards Crimea, and the Russian government says, not so fast. They send in the little green men, and Russia takes control of Crimea, blocking them. But where do the Nazis go from there? They head straight to the Donbass. They start assaulting the Russian population there. The Russians rose up. They declared independence. A curious fact, Vladimir Putin didn't recognize them as independent states. He rejected that. He said, no, you're part of Ukraine. We have to respect the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine, but we will support you in your effort to defend your rights. And so thus began the Ukrainian civil war in the Donbass, where the Ukrainian army, backed by these neo-Nazi military units, trying to forcefully impose themselves on a Russian population that rejects being manhandled by the Ukrainians. They form independent militias that are supported by the Russians. And now we have a war, a civil war. And it's a horrible war. It breaks down into front lines. And here's the nature of the fighting. Viktor Poroshenko, a president that came in after a series, the president before Zelensky, gave a speech. And he says, let me tell you what's going to happen. He's talking to the people of Donbass. Our kids, meaning Ukrainian kids, are going to go to kindergarten. Then they're going to go to the store, and they're going to go to the park, and they're going to have a normal life. Your kids are going to be cowering in the basements while we shell you every single day. You want to know why the Russians are mad? Because that's the life that these Russians were subjected to. 14,000 people lost their lives in the course of 8 years. Non-stop violence. It could have come to an end. In 2015, something called the Normandy Format, that was the Germans, the French, the Ukrainian government got together with the Russians there as observers, and they agreed to a ceasefire and keeping the Donbass in Ukraine, but that the legislation of Ukraine would pass a series of laws that gave sort of a special autonomous status to the Russians so that they wouldn't be impacted by the anti-Russian laws that had been passed. A very reasonable thing. But when Poroshenko tried to implement it, these neo-Nazis, remember this minority, told him, if you do that, we will kill you. Again, we're talking about what the definition of an insurrection is. Imagine somebody telling Joe Biden, if you sign that legislation, I'm going to kill you. the Secret Service would be all over that person. That would be the last you ever heard of him, rightfully so. But here the Nazi says, you sign it, you die. So guess what happens? He doesn't sign it. Zelensky comes in on a platform of peace, and he wants to implement Minsk. But he was told, not just told, they made a videotape of this where the guy basically says to the videotape, if he signs it, he'll be hanging by the neck until dead on some major Kiev thoroughway. And it's the truth. If Zelensky signed it, he'd be hanging by the neck until dead. Who runs Ukraine? It's not Zelensky. It's not the parliament. It's the Nazis. And if you're a Russian, and I'm going to leave it with this, because this is the emotional part. You thought losing 14,000 people was emotional? I'm going to give you what emotional is. Emotional is losing 23 to 32 million people in a war against Nazi Germany. That is what defines Russia today. Every major town, every major city has a monument to the people who died. Every family lost people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a dozen, 20.